Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Ana Martina. Yo soy la jefa de educación y entrenamiento para la Federación de Cooperativas de Trabajadores.
Hi, my name is Ana Martina. I am.
¿La interpretación está funcionando ya?
Let me know if the interpretation is working right now.
Un segundo. Elizabeth creo que lo puede hacer. Un segundo.
I think Elizabeth will do that. 1 second.
Okay, here is Ana Martina. She was introducing. Thank you very much, everybody. My name again is Ana Martina. I am the Chief of Training and Facilitation for the Federation of Cooperatives of the United States of America. And here I am helping you during this session. This session is part of all the series of fundamentals of cooperatives. And today we are going to be dealing with a very important issue, which is the foundations of Cooperative Members Association. This is at the agenda, and we already talked about the instructions and directions how to get access to languages. We are going to be talking about the compensation for funders. What is that? Where, how you can consider that, or why? How are the ways to approach this? What are the key considerations? And today we are going to have two owner workers that are going to be sharing their experiences. This is one of the sessions organized by the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. We are a grassroots organization that offers benefits and education to all the members of cooperative workers in the United States, and also provides help to other different spaces of work. It's part of a program of the Co-op clinic that offers technical education, financial systems. If you are a member of a cooperative and you need help, support with training or facilitation, you can immediately get access to us, communicate with us through our web page that is on the slide, and we will be able to contact you and help. We have a guide already, which is already available about all these issues and other issues that we have been publishing and we have been updating, and these are also available in the page of the Cooperative Clinic. Each of these guidance we have been presenting in meetings, and also we are working right now in the guide with today's issues. We are going to continue with the presentation today. We are going to introduce you to Julian Hill. He works in Georgetown University. He is a lawyer. He's a supervisor lawyer for social enterprises and for the Clinic of Justice and Law. He also helps a lot of cooperatives, worker cooperatives, including contracts, gestions, governance, regulations, and he always is looking into connect these cooperatives with different organizations in the community. He got his law degree from Harvard and his philosophy master of Northwestern University. We are going to have today Sabiha Basrai. She is a part of a cooperative design action collective. There is a cooperative that is full of workers that is devoted to help all the justice movement through arts, communication, and graphic design. And she is a member of Alliance of South Asian Taking Action, where she works specifically fighting against Islamophobia. And she is a part of the advisory committee for political education in the public, and she is a professor at the University of San Francisco. She obtained her BAs in art and design from California Polytechnic Institute. Also, our third speaker today is going to be Jason Wiener. He is an boutique, he is the director of a law boutique firm in rights and cooperative law. He specializing in cooperative law, in share ownership models, finance cooperative between, among other topics. And he has been able to support dozens of workers' comp in the United States in a lot of issues like transaction, conversion, and financing. He holds a BS degree from Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and he has a doctorate from the Law School at University of Suffolk, where he received an honor enrollment with a full scholarship. Thank you very much. This is Julian Hill. Thank you very much for inviting me.
For putting this together. I'll note that in addition to serving as a legal advisor to worker cooperatives, I'm also in the process of forming a worker cooperative. And so these questions have been coming up quite a bit in a lot of different ways. Before we get into it, I just want to note that although you have a few lawyers who will be discussing this topic of founders' compensation today, we are not providing legal advice. And so this information is strictly meant to be informational, educational. And so just kind of keep that in mind. Every cooperative, every group of people who want to start a cooperative are differently situated. And there are lots of facts that need to be taken into account. And so we recommend that you all make sure that you speak to an attorney when that time comes to work on some of these sorts of issues. And with that disclaimer, we can move on to the next slide. Awesome. So today's conversation is about founders' compensation, and it seems like it would be an appropriate place to start with talking about what exactly are we talking about when we're discussing founders' compensation. And so generally speaking, we're talking about what's the method through which the cooperative is paying its founders for the sweat equity that they've been putting into the cooperative prior to potentially operations, prior to the cooperative even yielding any sort of profits, where they're basically sort of volunteering. And so sweat equity, to clarify what we're talking about there, is really all of that unpaid labor that co-op owners are putting into the cooperative. And so for folks who are in that process now, you know exactly what we're talking about, having these weekly, bi-weekly, monthly meetings with your steering committee to think through the product or service that you want to put out into the world, all of the meetings you might be having with consultants, with other worker cooperatives where you're trying to get other information, you know, all of that work that you're putting into getting this business off of the ground, just like with any other sort of business. And so, so the conversation is really around sort of what are some ways to compensate folks for that work. Let's go on to the next slide. And so fundamental to that question, it really is having an understanding of what are some of the reasons why you would even think about the idea of founders' compensation. And this list is not meant to be exhaustive, but we wanted to give you a couple of things to take into account. So first, one way to think about the reason is that it's a fair way to treat people's volunteered labor, right? And so the idea is that if I'm working with a cooperative, let's say for 5 years, and it takes until that 5th year to really start making the profits, then, you know, that 4 years or so, you know, part of what we want to think about is whether or not there should be some way to compensate folks for that labor. And so the idea is that if I've been putting in these 4 years of work, how do we treat that labor as compared to someone who comes in that 5th year at the, you know, in their first iteration of working as a worker co-op member, who gets to benefit from all of the work that we've been putting in, as co-founders during that first, let's say, 4 years. And so part of it is thinking about sort of fair treatment for people's labor that they've volunteered. Before I go into the second point, I'll note people should feel free, and we actually encourage you to put all of your questions that you might have into the chat. We'll have a session later where we will be addressing those. And so just so people don't forget those questions, and so that myself and the folks who will be talking later can maybe integrate answers to some of those questions as we get to that part of the session, we encourage you to also lift up any of those questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them as soon as we can. So a second reason to think about founders' compensation really is centered around this idea of founder syndrome. And this is not anything that's particularly unique to cooperatives, but you're really talking about the idea around, hey, I've been working on this thing for 5 years, from idea to those initial meetings. This is, for a lot of founders, you know, their quote unquote baby. And what that can lead to in a lot of context is there being a sense of wanting to sort of control the business and where it goes, and the idea around the co-founder's vision, the co-founder's values, all of those being wrapped up into the actual cooperative itself. And the ways in which sometimes that 4 years or however many years of the labor that's been volunteered, sometimes them using that as leverage to say, hey, you know, this is my baby. You weren't here when I was quote unquote shooting at the gym, for folks who might know that reference. And so when you think about providing compensation for that labor, it kind of helps to create a bit more of an equitable power dynamic, where it kind of allows for those founding members to sort of be able to feel like, hey, I've been compensated, and I can sort of relieve some of the control that I might have had around this idea, because I'm not able to sort of leverage this idea around being the person who did all of this volunteer work. So thinking about those power dynamics. A third reason to think about founders' compensation is really about sustaining the model itself, and thinking about that as a way to avoid exploitation. And so you can think about how people are differently situated when it comes to trying to start a worker cooperative. When we think about this as a larger movement and a larger response to a system that oftentimes is not responding to the needs of marginalized communities, or is not creating opportunities for people who are on the margins, we don't want to have a system where that volunteer labor is something that is not compensated, because then what can happen is you have folks who have certain levels of privilege, have certain levels of access to capital, who are better situated to be able to do that volunteer work, and then are the ones who are therefore more able to start worker cooperatives. And so there's a tension around accessibility that thinking through founders' compensation can help get to, at least in part. And that's not to say it resolves all of those types of issues, which we won't be talking about in depth here, you know, getting access to funding, the ways in which different social structures impact people's access to different types of opportunities. Go to the next slide. So this is going to be the meat of my piece to this. And this is, okay, we've talked about what founders' compensation is. We've got a sense of what are at least some of the reasons you might want to think about instituting a structure in your cooperative that recognizes founders' compensation. And so let's talk through some of the ways in which that can actually work. And again, this is not meant to be exhaustive. You got some folks here who have more experience around definitely some of these than I do, but let's get into it. So one way to think about structuring founders' compensation is through term loans, right? And this could be a relatively straightforward process. You find some way, whether it's through calculating the value of the business, or finding a way through looking at hours and hourly rates and how much people have worked, to more or less calculate what the founder's value of work comes up to, and think about, okay, the cooperative and that founding member, those founding members agreeing on the value, agreeing on some terms, and actually having a loan agreement through which that founding member, those sets of founding members could be compensated with respect to that labor. And I'll note, this is, I think in most cases going to be, a taxable sort of transaction, and you need to make sure that as a cooperative, you talk with your accountant and sort of figure out what some of the logistics are going to be with respect to your balance sheet. But we will, as was mentioned before, be circulating a guide that will give you some resources to kind of help you think through how you might be able to calculate sweat equity, how you might want to consider those things when it comes to term loans and some of these other approaches. Another way in which you could think about the process for providing founders compensation isn't necessarily compensation per se, but it's through governance rights. And that could look a couple different ways. So one way it could look like is through your board of directors and your founding members having certain rights vis-a-vis those seats. And so that could look like the actual putting aside of certain board seats, a certain number of board seats specifically for election by your founding members. It could be them having a guaranteed right to certain seats on the board, so on and so forth. But the idea is that, there's a special sort of governance right that allows them to, as founding members, be a part of the board. Another consideration when it comes to governance, which could be used in concert with what we just talked about with board seats or even separately, is that the founding members could have certain rights as it relates to quorum and or voting rights. And that could look a number of ways. One way it could look with respect to quorum would be that quorum would constitute, and this is probably the case for a lot of folks in co-ops, a majority of your members in general, but 100%, let's say, of your founding members, right? And so even if you had a co-op of 10 people and you had 2 founding members, if you had a requirement around quorum, there could be a scenario where you had those 8 members who were getting together, but they might not necessarily be able to do anything because there wasn't one or both sort of founding members sort of there. And there are a lot of power dynamics, some tricky things you need to sort of think through, right? All of these offerings, I'll say, have pros and cons. And so it's not to say that these are right or wrong, but these are just some different ways in which, in certain contexts, certain of these strategies might make sense. When it comes to voting, something similar could be instituted where the founders, as a separate sort of class, potentially, have to reach a certain threshold just among themselves, right? So the majority of all the members, and let's say a majority of the founding members, or a higher threshold or something to that effect. So governance rights is another bucket where you can provide founders with some sort of incentives that recognizes the work that they've done with respect to the cooperative in those early years. So a third bucket kind of gets more to probably what a lot of you may have seen and are familiar with, which is basically around dividends rights, or the rights that you will have to the profits of the actual cooperative. And there are a number of ways you can do this. One way that I've seen done from some of the work that I was doing is you have a separate class, a separate patron class that specifically is for the founders. And so when you think about how you're going to be allocating your profits during whatever time period you decide to do that, that class, the founders, might be able to have a certain sort of right to a portion of the profits. And then as regular members, they might have potentially another ability or right to certain of other parts of the profits. And so again, you want to sort of discuss some of that structure with your attorney and with an accountant to sort of think through some of those details. Another way that you could potentially think about the founders getting access to increased dividend rights would be through a multiplier. And what that could look like is when you think about whatever your metric is for patronage, hours worked, income, some combination thereof, some other factor, contracts that are brought in, so on and so forth. The founding members might have sort of a multiple that increases their portion of that total amount. So maybe instead of their hours being 1 hour, just like every other member, maybe that hour could be 1.2 hours or some other sort of multiplier thereof that allows them to get a bit more of a portion of those profits, again, based on the fact that they've done a lot of this volunteer labor. The third and final way that I'm going to talk about it with respect to dividend rights is you can actually have just a separate class that's not a patron class, which we can talk about. We can talk about a little bit more when we get into the conversation, but as an investor class. And so there's certain jurisdictions, there's certain entity types where you can have your sort of regular worker owner sort of class. And in addition to that, you can have investor classes, which would be individuals who typically will not have a vote with respect to the goings-ons of the cooperative, but have a financial interest. And so there's a universe where you can have your founding members also being a part of that investor class, being entitled to certain percentages of the profits, and then also sort of being sort of regular patron members. Okay, I'm sure there's a bunch of questions that are gonna come up from that. And so looking forward to talking about that. Shifting now to wage additions. That's another way that you could think about compensating your founders. And the way that that could look is if I'm a founding member and our cooperative does some sort of, let's say, consulting, maybe my rate is higher than the rate of someone who's newer to the co-op, even though we're doing the same work. And that again could be a way in which you compensate the workers who've been around by increasing their wages, right? So it's not about profits, but actually sort of the wages that are paid out doing the day-to-day work. A fifth option would be an employment contract. And there are a number of sort of reasons that you might want to think about that. There could be, in certain contexts, some beneficial tax implications for the founders and for the co-op. But again, in thinking about some of the power dynamics, that's something that you want to take into account. But essentially, it's a situation where you, as a founding member, and the co-op engage in a contract, an employment contract that names certain rights with respect to compensation over a certain time period that, again, is meant to sort of compensate folks for the work that they've done. And that's, I think that's something that might come up, and I'd be interested when we get to the conversation with Sabiha and Jason around with conversions. The sixth way that you can think about structuring founders' compensations through profit sharing agreements. And this again is sort of an agreement that you would have with between the co-op and the founding members. It is, it's a good sort of option if you, as a co-op, don't necessarily want to have a situation where you have these inflexible repayment schedules from a loan. And it allows you to sort of set an agreement that really thinks about the sort of fair market value of the sweat equity that's provided by the founding member. And you can specify certain timelines with respect to payment. There could be certain thresholds that you think about. And so it gives you a little bit of flexibility, but you want to think about what that means for the members' rights to be on the governance team of the cooperative. And a lot of these are questions of state law, and some of these are questions that come up around sort of tax law. And so that's another way that you could potentially approach founders' compensation. Let's go to the next slide. All right, cool. So here's just a list of some considerations to take into account. Some of them I've already alluded to within the context of the conversation that we were just having. And so some of it you would want to think about with respect to labor law and labor law restrictions. And so I'm thinking about things like whether or not they're going to be an employee, whether or not it's going to be an employment agreement versus whether it's going to be some other orientation that allows them to kind of not be an employee of the company. It can get, these are things you want to think about, not just on the federal level, but there's state labor laws you need to take into account. And in cities as well, you think about a city like New York City, there are also local labor laws that you'll need to take into account. On the second set of key considerations around tax law. And again, this is something to think about both from the state and the federal level, and the ways in which certain of these arrangements could increase the tax burden or decrease the tax burden for either the founding member and or the co-op itself. And so again, making sure that you talk to an attorney who has some experience around that. Probably want to loop in an accountant as well to think that through. Third bucket, in terms of considerations around securities law. And, securities, are, you think about the common type that people think about. So like shares in a company, think about bonds, different types of instruments that allow people to invest in a company. And although in a lot of cases, if you're sort of a patron member, you're just a worker owner, it's a far smaller risk of having to do some of the lengthy registrations that are oftentimes required when offering these types of shares, member shares. It can get trickier when you're talking about investor members and investor classes. And so just making sure that you think through those questions. And part of the considerations that I'm lifting up here aren't necessarily to give you sort of an answer to a lot of these potential issues, but to actually empower you with maybe some questions or some areas that you'll want to check in around when you're talking to, let's say, a lawyer, you're talking to an accountant, saying, hey, do I need to think about any tax implications here? Are there any securities law implications, so on and so forth. You also want to make sure that you're doing accurate record keeping and making sure those systems are in place. We talked a little bit about sort of how certain things are going to be reflected differently on your balance sheet. And so just making sure that you're aware of that and that you're maintaining good record keeping, you're doing your due diligence around that. And then finally, just making sure you plan, plan as much as you think you need to, and then plan a little bit more, and then maybe plan a little bit more. And just to make sure that you avoid making some mistakes that could have some potentially significant negative impacts on you and your personal capacity or the cooperative itself. So I think I'm a few minutes early on my section, but I think we can go ahead and shift to the next piece because I see that there are 44 things in the chat. I'm imagining some of those are questions. Cool, so I'd like to bring to the floor, I mean, you can already see them, Sabiha Basrai, who was already introduced from Design Action Collective, and Jason Wiener from Jason Wiener PC to engage in a conversation. I have a couple prepared questions. It looks like folks have been going back and forth around a couple of these issues in the chat. And so as we go through these questions, I encourage Jason and Sabiha, feel free to integrate some of those questions into some of your responses. So why don't we go ahead and kick this off? So I'll start with Jason. And, as folks who are on the call are cooperatives, thinking about starting cooperatives, what should they be considering before engaging a lawyer? And at what stage would you recommend that they engage with a lawyer to address things like entity choice and founders compensation?
Thank you, Julian, for the overview. It was really tremendously helpful to frame this discussion. I believe, so I am a lawyer, and I've worked with dozens of steering committees and cooperatives over the last 12 years. And I am one who believes that founders can do much more work before talking to a lawyer than they might think. You should think of your lawyer as a resource to help actualize what you want to do. So most of what I think you should do is conceive of your desire, of what you want. What are your intentions? How would you like to manifest the cooperative in terms of its values, in terms of its design, and suspend judgment of what the law says, at least to have the discussions and to use that process to educate yourselves and empower yourselves so that you know when you can push and when you're bound by what the law requires. Very often, groups come to me and utilize me as an educator. And as much as I love that role, there's a lot of power that groups put in onto my role that I don't need to have. I want you to have that power. I want you to embody your intentions and that power. And so visualizing and taking control over the design of the cooperative is critical. In the chat, I have put a link to a free course that my firm has developed that anyone can go access, anyone can go through free. The purpose is to design your co-op for yourselves with the guidance and resources of our experience. And you can do all of that before talking to a lawyer, before paying a lawyer. And that process is intended to give you agency before you talk to the lawyer who might say, you can't do this, or you should do that. You should know what some of those considerations are first.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that thoughtful and robust answer, Jason. Just how, it's just great to see sort of a very client-centered approach on display, and that's important to see and to hear. And so I want to shift gears, at least shift sides, and kind of bring in Sabiha from the perspective of sort of a worker owner, and get your sense of sort of, if you were given advice to, worker co-ops, kind of based on the experiences you've had with lawyers, other folks on founders compensation, what would that be?
Thanks, Julian. And yes, I so appreciated your breakdown too, because Design Action Collective has been around for almost 20 years. And we actually we kind of spun off from another co-op that had been around for decades longer before, called Inkworks Press. And so a lot of our templates for the way we were running things kind of came from our friends who had been doing this for a long time. And but what we really completely did not do was document sweat equity in really any meaningful way. And we know, as you mentioned, Julian, like there's so many sacrifices by the kind of founders of a new project like this. And it really, in hindsight for us, it was a real mistake not to document that clearly using one of the many methods that Julian laid out. And I think at the time there was this culture of kind of everyone coming out of grassroots social justice activism spaces. Design Action Collective is dedicated to social justice movement support. So we came out of these spaces ourselves, and we had this culture of just everyone throw down for the cause, and we didn't prioritize formalities like tracking the time we weren't paying ourselves for in those hardest startup years. And we did have a profit sharing model, though, right away. Again, this was influenced by Inkworks Press, so we had some tools that they'd already developed to map onto. But our policy back then, and still is now, that 75% of the business's profits are divided equally amongst all the owners in proportion to hours worked that year, and then paid out after 3 years over the course of 5 years. But there was no differentiation between the founding members and other members with regards to this formula. And while founders were collecting more years worth of patronage as it was paid out over subsequent years, of course, those earliest years, the profit margins were pretty small. We had always had a lot of explicit rhetoric about equally weighting all workers' decision-making power. So these notes about basing quorum on whether a founder is there or having a different kind of weight to one's vote is really interesting and very much outside of the philosophy that Design Action has always had, where someone who's been a member for 15 years has the same voting rights as someone who's been a member for only a few months. And we have been committing to internal organizational development work to empower our newest members to really bring their voices into decision making and kind of help those of us who've been there longer to step back. Like, how do we share our institutional wisdom and knowledge without shutting down new ideas? So our struggle has actually been, our priorities around how to address founders syndrome has really been within this internal work around dynamics and relationship, and less about material compensation. But I think that lack of foresight in our early years to document sweat equity has been this kind of unsaid weird in the room that has come out in conversation in different ways over the years. And I think if we had created a really clear, transparent acknowledgement of sweat equity in the early days, it would have made current conversations easier, maybe not easier to have, but clearer. And that's something I'm here to tell you as a member of Design Action Collective for 15 plus years, that I very much wish we had had this very conversation back in the startup mode. But also, even though we did not, we're finding these ways to talk about equity and democracy while acknowledging that there are these kind of unsaid, uncaptured parts of our history and labor.
Thank you so much, Sabiha, for, that perspective and the vulnerability, the honesty there, and hopefully it is something that, folks who are here who are in different stages will be able to benefit from. And so I will aim not to comment on every answer. And so I will move to the next question. And I'll shift it back to Jason. So in thinking about the folks that you've worked with, can you give us an example or two of co-ops that you feel like have created, successful founders compensation arrangements?
I'll share the story. I can't share their names without their permission. And I want to first generalize for one moment and highlight this issue from a design standpoint, which is that founders who want to build cooperatives as cooperatives are generally choosing to form the business in a way that will generally benefit them less than if they form it a different way. And while we in this movement generally believe in universal democracy, we have to be willing to acknowledge the special contribution, perspective, risk, and lost opportunity associated with someone who starts a cooperative as a cooperative. I will admit, well, I will state that in my experience, most of those individuals, at least who I've come across, are white, which is a reflection of privilege, as well as a reflection of allyship insofar as they had a choice in how to form the business. And so that's a delicate choice and a delicate role that I play, but I want to acknowledge the significant privilege that brings individuals to form a cooperative and to whatever degree choose to avoid or forgo compensation. The issue is that when a cooperative is starting, when any business is starting, it is almost entirely not profitable for some number of years, which also coincide with when founders' patronage is highest. Now, according to general cooperative accounting, that would mean founders would receive a disproportionate share of loss. And under subchapter T, a loss can be allocated like a patronage dividend. It's a non-cash form of consideration. I can get a loss allocation, which offsets my other income if I have other income. But the problem is that founders are putting in labor and effort to catalyze a co-op, which may not be profitable until later, 5-10 years, when it is reliant on the contributions of lots of people by definition. And so it's then inaccurate to say that the profitability was the direct result of the founders, but they did have a role in catalyzing the growth of the organism that made it profitable. So that's a long introduction to one story, which is one example of something that doesn't work. I once thought that we could look back 5 years and count that patronage when the thing was profitable. And unfortunately, under the tax code, patronage dividends have to be calculated based on when that patronage was created, contributed. So there is a, by definition, one fiscal year window in which to look at both profit and patronage. That is not aligned with when founders are putting in sweat equity. So 2 examples I can give. One is I've been using founder compensation in these co-op models since 2015. And in most cases, I will create a patron member class for the founders, in which, as Julian summarized, I give them, or they ask for, I should say, special governance rights. They have quorum requirements, board seats, separate slices of the patronage pie. And in one case, that founder class had a sunset. It would vanish at a predefined date. And I think that is a phenomenally foresighted move, because founders should not exercise the kind of legacy, control, or power beyond their contribution. The ethos of the cooperative is based on effort and contribution, which ought to be totally egalitarian. And founders will provide decreasing rates of value over time. So that was one example. Another example is for founders who say, I'm not going to be here forever. I might provide founder effort for 3 years, and I might go do something else. But if this thing is successful, I want to be able to benefit beyond my patronage. So I've created separate series of investor shares for founders and gifted them to the founders so that they could receive dividends and pieces of equity, air quotes, because equity doesn't mean anything in a co-op unless there's a demutualization event. And many founders say, there's a small chance this thing gets bought by name whomever. I want a piece of that if I'm not here, for my family or for whomever. So I've issued founder investor shares as compensation as well. I'm currently working on a formation, and I will tell you from where I sit in my role with my experience, this conversation is always uncomfortable and fraught. I am always pushing founders to recognize their ego and have a really honest conversation about what they want their role to be in forming a cooperative and what they genuinely need. Because there is a balance point beyond which this is no longer a cooperative. And I have to have, and I do have, very, very frank conversations with founders so that in whatever role I play, I help preserve the ethos, not just the legal compliance, but the ethos of the cooperative.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's the contradictions at some point can come up. So I'm glad that you lifted up the need to at least have a conversation where folks are informed about the extent to which they're going against some of the values that they purport to be a part of. Because not every worker cooperative is the same. There's some worker cooperatives that, that have a different set of values, right? And so I think that's important to be at least frank about, so that people are on the same page. So I wanted to shift back to you, Sabiha, and could you give us a little bit more, maybe some insight around what were some of the main considerations when you all were thinking about founders' compensation, if you want to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, and so appreciating all of the wisdom in the room and the chat. So one thing that's occurring to me as I'm hearing Jason break down those uncomfortable details is that there's both founder value that founders bring, and there's also this concept of what is equitable, who has access to even be a founder, who has the kind of stability and the maybe generational wealth or support systems, infrastructure to say, like, I have the startup time, capital, what have you, to be a founder. And how do we acknowledge, understand systems of oppression, racism, classism, and all of these things that make it impossible for a lot of people to have access to even be a founder in the first place. And when we then allocate money, benefits, resources differentially across all the workers based on foundership or seniority, how does that then not align with values around equity? And those are exactly the kinds of conversations that Design Action is digging into and continues to dig into. Because one way we tried to address founder compensation and was like, well, we couldn't afford to pay ourselves we could not afford paid time off in the first few years of Design Action. So all of us were working whatever hours we needed to put into this business to make it successful and not paying ourselves to take time off. So when we finally could afford to give ourselves a paid time off policy, we started to roll that in by seniority. Like, well, these folks have been working for 5 years with no vacation, paid vacation. Let's give them like a couple weeks of paid vacation. And then the newest person who just joined this year gets like 1 week. And then we kind of, as we added more, as we were able to afford more paid time off and increase the amount of paid time off we were giving each other, we were still creating this like seniority-based differential scale, which was not based on any math that either Julian or Jason have mentioned yet. It was like, I guess this feels right, and it didn't feel right, because eventually we were in a situation where some members had a lot of paid time off and some had hardly any, and it wasn't actually helping our shop be more democratic, be more healthy. And it definitely didn't align with our values around equity. And so we did away with that. We also had to have some hard conversations about just like letting go of unsaid founder compensation expectations, because since we had not instituted any of these policies in our early days, any attempt to do so now all just felt wrong. It felt like there was no fit. And so we actually did just, and are still perhaps reflecting on that for those of us who've been there longer, to be able to feel like, yes, I did gain a lot in my life for being part of Design Action's startup years. I also sacrificed a lot, but me getting compensated in some way now isn't actually aligning with the way that I want to be part of this shop today. And so for us, it's actually been a lot of letting go of feelings of entitlement to some kind of founder compensation. And I have no regrets around that. As much as I wish that we'd had this knowledge around systems we could have put in place earlier, as one of the oldest members now, I care more about our newer members feeling like they have agency and ownership over this co-op, and less, and actively want to work against the kind of deferential treatment that we give to founders. Just because I've been there longer doesn't actually mean I have the best idea here. And so that's, I think, a philosophical question that all of you have to like wrestle with in your shop, about how do you want to show and honor, respect each other's labor, and also fly in the face of what capitalism teaches us around how we have and hold power.
Thank you, Sabiha. You know, it's, yeah, I mean, I haven't been in those conversations in different capacities. Definitely difficult. And it's making me think, oh, we should have had a slide on why not to do founders compensation potentially as well. Next time. All right, so I want to shift it back to Jason. And I mean, this has kind of been in some ways scattered throughout this conversation. And I want to sort of ask it a bit more plainly to kind of get more elaboration. You know, you, as you mentioned before, are navigating a lot of different power dynamics within the context of being legal counsel for folks. And not all of them are going to look like you. And not all of them are going to, you know, share your privilege. And I've definitely been similarly situated in some instances. So how do you ensure that white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, things of that nature are not dictating advice and legal options that you're providing to cooperatives on issues of founders compensation, but even potentially other related topics?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question and this part of the conversation. As I mentioned, I would be remiss not to highlight that a disproportionate number of founders who I interact with have been white and reflect a level of privilege that is not generally representative of this movement or the need for cooperatives. So I take your question two ways. One is that I, in particular, and we as a law firm generally, have a duty to be engaging in our own anti-oppression work and to ensure that our advice and perspective is aware of patriarchy, white supremacy, ableism, and inherent systemic power imbalances so that I and we can begin to undermine and dismantle them in the advice we give. That takes our own work, our own awareness, and it takes our own willingness to challenge the equity of law. And that's one of our core norms, is to not just assume the law is just at face value, but rather to look for just outcomes and find any and all legal and quasi-legal options to pursue that path. So we've done some work to hold ourselves to norms of conduct and work that embody this spirit of curiosity and of self-inquiry. That also means that I have different approaches with clients. The other part of the work is how I relate to clients themselves. There, I'm limited in some respects by who I'm talking to. So I might be talking to the leader of a steering committee, and I have to trust my advice is filtering through to the broader group. I approach that by looking at the other person as a foil. And by that, I mean, I'm looking at them to see how they react when I push them on cooperative values, principles, and their approach to design. As Sabiha was discussing, I push founders to conceive of the cooperative when they're no longer relevant or even involved. I try to get them to define the cooperative in terms of their irrelevance. At what point is this feasible beyond your contribution? Who needs to be involved? How big does this need to be? And some of the language I use is rooted in just the business. And I get to take that from the client themselves. So I'm contextualizing their work in relation to their aims, their goals, their purpose. And I generally am pushing white, cis, male founders much harder on these topics than otherwise, because they need to be confronted with the power dynamic that's at play and the inherently exclusionary nature of their design. And I don't say that to be judgmental of the individual. I say that to be judgmental of the system in which they're designing a cooperative. And I have seen them confront the reality that they have to be pushing past their comfort zone to be creating an inclusive cooperative. But there's a limit to what I can do on paper and with the law, and what they need to do in terms of culture, organizing, relating, and actualizing inclusivity. And I'm aware of that.
Indeed, it is an internal work that, lawyers, law firms, and if there are lawyers, law school students on the call, I hope you're taking some of that to heart. And that goes for even, developers, other TA providers, right? A lot of that work has to start internal. And as you mentioned at the end of your answer, Jason, the co-op itself, right? And so, Sabiha, you were talking a little bit about this and wanted to, just get a sense of sort of your thoughts around, how does class, race, gender oppression, affect the decisions around this. You talked a little bit about it, but would love to get a little bit more if you have any other things you want to elaborate on.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the things I'm really proud of is that Design Action Collective has historically had an explicit commitment to building a shop made up of members who are of the movements that we're serving, who are most impacted by the movements we're serving. So that has meant an intentional recruitment of folks who are underrepresented in our field because of structural oppressions under white supremacy, patriarchy, etc., heterosexism. And that's helped us to be a diverse team. That said, we are by no means perfectly figuring out how to operate without the pressures of capitalism and without the structures of white supremacy limiting our access to education and skills building and finding folks to build this team. So we still have much work to do, and we embrace the concept of this being a lifelong practice, that anti-oppression work is a lifelong practice. It's not that you take one diversity, equity, inclusion training and then your hiring team has fixed everything. And so we also acknowledge that those of us who are from minoritized communities have internalized these systems as well. So I myself, as someone who grew up as the daughter of Muslim Indian immigrants in the 1980s and 90s, very much I have experienced the kind of post 9/11 anti-Muslim oppressions in this country, but I have also benefited very much from model minority status that implicates me in white supremacy. And so I'm in my own journey of unlearning that. So I invite all of you here who have an express commitment and values to solidarity, economy, to supporting each other and our projects, to also build into your kind of really regular practice of finding ways to study and train with each other to unlearn these systems, because we, as much as our co-ops are beautifully envisioned, we have the capacity to replicate those systems in the way that we work with each other despite our best intentions. So one of the things that Design Action has committed to is regular anti-oppression trainings. That means we build it into our budget, we build it into our schedules, we prioritize it as just as important as our client work, and we resource ourselves through this very network to hire other co-ops to help us train on these issues. And that has turned into, we've operationalized things as far as what are the requirements in our hiring practices that we can change so that there are fewer hurdles that exist for people who are underrepresented in our field? How can we rewrite the way that we do our internal evaluations so that systemic problems are not being reflected as interpersonal problems? And those are the kinds of things that we really are continuing to work on. And I wish I had we do this, so you should all do this. But I am very, find satisfaction in the work and knowing that that is long-term work. And to the point of this theme around founders, our founder generation was mostly women and people of color. We wrote explicit political points of unity, and as we have grown, as we have added members to our shop, as other folks have transitioned out, we also use that document as a living document that we can revisit and we can make sure reflects the politics and the analysis and the maturity of this shop as we've all been learning together. And even though we failed to explicitly address sweat equity in the startup years, acknowledging that there have been all these different ways that our members have contributed to the success of Design Action, just being a successful co-op 20 years in is something that I'm proud of. And I'm really grateful that my coworkers have co-created this space that I get to be a part of. Even though we didn't accurately capture any of that sweat equity, we've all been kind of called into this work collaboratively to be able to bring our whole selves into it. So I think that the biggest takeaway for me from trainings like this is to like remember and remind each other to plan from that place of abundance and not let the kind of scarcity mindset limit our imagination around how we could be in right relationship with one another. And that's gonna, that alignment makes is like the glue that makes us have that strength to figure out these very specific points of tension or problems or questions or points of confusion where we need to, you know, hire Jason or kind of be in trainings like this with each other and skills share.
So thank you both for tackling that question. So much more that could be said. We could have a whole session just on that. And so I want to stop there and open up the floor now to questions from the audience. And I think what we'll do, we've been keeping track of the questions that we've been getting. Unfortunately, I'm not 100% sure what questions have already been answered. And so I will go through a few of them, and then to the extent that folks have a live question, I'll try to sort of go in between those two. And so let's start, and this was a planned topic that we were gonna discuss, but it also came up in the chat a few times. And so I'll open it up. There's a question that comes up around sort of co-op conversions and how this works within that context. And so Jason, I guess I'll throw that to you.
So the context for conversions, to contrast, much of my commentary about founder compensation has related to forming a brand new cooperative. This question relates to forming a cooperative based on a conversion of an existing business. In many respects, conversions bring all of these questions to a very fine point. The conversion is about the literal transaction from the founder, probably, or at least an owner, to a number of owners. And while it's implied, I urge clients to have really clear, explicit conversations about the founder sweat equity value that is embedded in the purchase price. When you buy a business, you're buying its computers, its website, the passwords to its database, and goodwill. And goodwill is the tax accounting bucket that we put sweat equity into. This is the intangible value of what has been created. And not all of it has been created by the founder. Not all of it has been created by one person, but the conversion is the moment of when things change from what it was to the cooperative. And that is a transaction that has a healthy opportunity, creates a healthy opportunity to explore the value of sweat equity. And we have to be looking again at the same lenses of power, race, privilege, when looking at who's selling and who's buying and what is being sold and what is being bought. And there are a lot of really sticky power and economic questions that arise when looking at conversion. But conversions in some ways make it easier because there doesn't need to be a system for goodwill because it's all being bundled together in the sale.
Gotcha. Thank you for that response, Jason. And I'll say for folks who have live questions, if you want to go to reactions and raise your hand, I can kind of keep that in in mind as we sort of build up a queue. But if I don't get those, I'll just continue to go through these questions. So the next one is, so the compensation comes out of initial investments, is the question. So is the basis, I guess the question is the basis for the compensation, the initial investments of the founder members? And either of you, if you want to chime in on that.
It seems to me like the way we have been talking about founders' compensation is the hard to capture sweat equity piece. There was one of our founders did make a personal loan to the company to make sure we could buy our first computers, and then that loan was paid back on a predetermined schedule. I feel like that is the easiest way to be like, well, you put in this and we said we'd give it back to you, and we did. But what about all of those, as you mentioned, Julian, the meetings, the late nights talking to each other about how to do this, the consultations with other folks, the years of working at very little pay or holding paychecks when cash flow was hard. Like, those are the parts that, because this needed to take priority. Those are the kinds of things that I think about when we talk about founder compensation, and it is extremely hard to add a dollar amount to that.
Thank you, Sabiha. Next question is, and I think, Jason, you had mentioned you'd be willing to talk about this. Has anyone worked with startup phase contributions? And I guess related to that, there was a question later just around if there are any resources for valuing a business during a conversion process. So I don't know if there are just resources that folks could use around valuation that we could lift up.
Sure. So Slicing Pie is a book that describes a dynamic way to address contribution. And it's used with more traditional ownership structures. It has been, I think, paired with some alternative governance systems like sociocracy, holacracy, but it can be used by any business. I think it's complicated, and in many ways it mirrors the mechanism of patronage accounting for worker cooperatives. But what it does differently is it gives language to the company in terms of what they track as patronage. And it can go beyond just hours worked. It can include, I paid for certain expenses, I built the website. There's a more nuanced and dynamic way to measure contributions and have that then reflected in equity. I think that we could, as a movement, be looking at similar approaches. There is limited amount of law on this idea of weighting, applying multiples on patronage. And while the law is not super clear or super favorable, there's at least some precedent for creating a weighting or multiplier system for patronage that looks at more things than just hours worked. The last part of the question was around conversion resources and valuation. There are experts, professionals who do business valuation. I think that is an important resource. It is a nuanced practice, and no two businesses are exactly alike. So I think there has to be some consideration for the uniqueness of each business in terms of how it's valued. And goodwill doesn't have an objective value. a lot of valuation firms will look at what multiples exist for different aspects of the business, whether it's revenue or profit or discounted cash flow. And often the multiples are reflections of how investors or other people will pay for that goodwill or sweat equity value that's been built. But conversions don't really involve the same type of financial buyer. And so those are not entirely relevant data points, but the method could be useful.
Thank you, Jason. Let's go ahead and whoever's from Cooperation Humboldt, if you want to come off of mute and give us your question or contribution.
Thank you. Hi. So in a conversion where, say, a founding group of 5 new co-op owners purchases an existing business for $400,000 and then allocates a good portion of their surplus over the years to pay the mortgage on that land purchase or on that business purchase. And then a new member comes in and they are no longer responsible for that business expense. Is it a category? Is it a member class that solves the issue of the fact that they just allocated a good portion of their surplus in the founding years to paying for something that future members will not need to pay?
That raises, that highlights the need for good design in how the cooperative is formed. And that would be one of the early questions I ask, because you're highlighting an inequity that can be the subject of some design. That does not have to just be an expense borne by the founders. Some on here may understand that could be an expense that's covered by surplus allocations out of the collective account, which means that all members forever will be covering that expense. That just needs to be discussed and systematized so that accountants know exactly where that's coming from, or the members and the board know how to budget and allocate an expense.
Awesome, thank you for that, Jason. Let me see. So another question that we have is, so from an, I'm not sure if this has been answered yet. If it has, let me know. From an accounting perspective, how should startups be tracking sweat equity on the books? Anyone have thoughts on that?
I have been asking myself this question ever since I was invited to participate in this, because I wish I had an articulation of, well, if I could go back in time to those early meetings of Design Action Collective, what would I have proposed? And one thing I can think of right now is just to have tracked our time. Like, even if we weren't going to pay ourselves for all of that time, because we didn't have the budget to pay ourselves for all of that time, I wish we had just tracked it. So it was there and transparent for each other and subsequent new members to understand what unpaid labor built that era of the shop. And then we could still address the same questions we are now around equity and structural inequality. It wouldn't have automatically meant that, well, Sabiha did X amount of unpaid labor between 2006 and 2010, so we should now give her back wages for that. Like, that's not what I'm implying, but it would have been some clear method of feeling seen for that time, and then having that as one of the data points in a conversation for the shop culture we wanted for our future. And it's not a formula, but it is I think it would have been useful. It would have served a purpose. And I probably now would have advocated again, if that had been the case, I would have advocated against using that to somehow augment my wages now, that we don't have the same cash flow issues we did 15 years ago. But it would have been a way to market, and we could, as a collective, discuss how that labor could be acknowledged, and in one of the many forums that folks have outlined here today.
I want to highlight one risk factor to consider in that approach. I'll play lawyer for just 1 minute. Tracking or requiring founders or worker owners to track time that is not paid is a very easy way to document a wage and hour claim if somebody believes that they have been wronged or is fired or something happens later. It is the breadcrumb trail to a wage claim that just needs to be acknowledged. I've not on the basis of that concern, but rather I've encouraged founders to think of a more holistic approach to consider an estimate or reflected aggregate value that was not compensated, which can be reflected in an aggregate salary that was not paid, or how much would I have done that work for if I were merely a freelance worker or merely a contractor or merely an employee? What is the foregone income and the value of that to the cooperative had it had the cash flow to pay me? What sort of contract would I have entered into for that body of work? But I generally suggest thinking of numerous tracking mechanisms and creating more of a constellation of approaches so that the values can emerge of what's really being discussed. Ours is narrow and surgical, and again, reinforces systemic inequity. Total value reflects another set of systemic failures and another set of systemic injustice. So I suggest taking a number of data points and putting them together and having an explicit conversation of unpaid value.
Yeah, I want to 100% agree with Jason on that. The idea of value versus quantifiable numbers being the spirit of what we're talking about here, and also to remind each other that as much as it can feel impossible to imagine a scenario where someone will leave under bad terms, when you are so in a committed, like, we're going to make this work and we're working really hard to get this to be successful, but to plan as well for the unlikely scenario where someone does leave under bad terms, so that you're not working out those kinds of sticky details in a situation where people are already really mad at each other. And so to hold ourselves to principled standards around that too. I think when we're stressed out and kind of maybe bringing our worst selves to a meeting, to have a set of kind of values and principles that we can scaffold us through those hardest moments is very important.
So unfortunately, we are near our end, but I'll ask one last question before we hand it over. And it was, has there been guidance by union lawyers on some of this? Union contracts often institute tiers for different status at different times and with different ways to show appreciation with compensation.
The union environment presents a host of additional considerations. Union shops are more regulated. I was a union lawyer when I started and only remember enough to know that it's complicated, it's more regulated, and check your collective bargaining agreement. And more unions.
Yeah, Design Action is a unionized shop, and our contract and our bylaws, it's not a clean fit because the union model is designed to protect workers from management, and we're the workers and the owners are the same people. So our reasons for being a union shop are multiple beyond needing a union rep and a shop steward for operational reasons. I'm happy to talk about that at a different session. But yes, we have leaned on our union primarily to hold ourselves to union standards and remember what side we're on when we're talking about workers' rights, and not get stuck in the like just what's best for the business, but really what's best for all of the workers.
So let's give Sabiha and Jason some love in the chat. Thank you for everything. And I'll pass it to Ana Martina to close us out.
Gracias, Julian.
Thank you, Julian and Jason and Sabiha, for all of this experience and knowledge that you shared today. All of your questions, information that I think that we have enough for another session. Thank you so much for the interpreters who support us so we can have language justice present and accessible. And thanks to all of my coworkers who were supporting all of us in the chat, gathering the questions, translating Spanish and English, and all the different people who were in charge of the organization. Matt, who was coordinating the logistics of this webinar. We are going to send the recording of this webinar by email as a follow-up